Hello, fellow humans, and welcome to Beyond Words, the podcast where we explore the science and experience of language, music, and the mind. I'm your host, Garrett Oyama, a speech-language pathologist, a musician, and a PhD student researcher. And in each episode, we'll dive into conversations with world-class researchers, clinicians, and thinkers to uncover how communication really works. From brain and behavior to sound and meaning, we go beyond the traditional boundaries to better understand what it means to connect, express, and be human through this amazing capacity of language. Hey everyone, welcome to Beyond Words, conversations on language, music, and mind in collaboration with speechtherapypd.com. I'm your host, Garrett Oyama, a musician practicing SLP and PhD student with an interest in all things language, music, and cognition. I'm so excited that we have the one and only Dr. Rhiannon Luyster with us today. Dr. Rhiannon is an associate professor of communication sciences and disorders at my alma mater, Emerson College, and a core faculty member of Kids at Emerson. Her research focuses on language development in autistic children with a particular emphasis on variability in language profiles, unconventional language features, and how caregiver input shapes communication. Dr. Luyster's work challenges deficit-based interpretations of autistic language by examining how features such as neologisms, focus interest, and caregiver-child interaction can reflect meaningful, rule-governed linguistic systems. Her research has important implications for assessment, intervention, and how clinicians conceptualize language differences in autism. She also happened to be my favorite grad school professor. Thank you so much for being here. Before we get started, we have a few items to mention. Most of these upcoming podcasts, including today's, will include an accompanying course on speech therapy PD that is available for 0.1 ASHA CEUs. And we each receive compensation for speech therapy PD for this podcast, but there are no other non-financial disclosures to report at this time. So without further ado, Rhiannon, welcome to Beyond Words. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's great to see you again. I always just ask the guests a little bit about their origin story. And I don't know if I ever got yours in grad school. But yeah, what got you interested in this field?
Oh, this is one of my favorite stories. Gosh, if I didn't get a chance to tell you this story, Garrett, what an oversight on my part when we were at Emerson. So my origin story, I think there's sort of like different threads that came together for me. I guess in terms of my origin story of being interested in kids, I was one of those people who, as soon as I was no longer being babysat, I wanted to like babysit other kids, you know? So I started out as like a babysitter through middle school, high school, and then I guess I first got interested in psychology in high school. There was an AP class that was, something very fundamental about psychology or psychological concepts or something. And that really sort of snagged my attention. So by the time I got to college, I knew I was interested in psych and I knew I was interested in kids. So those were both sort of important realizations. And then I think it was after my junior year of college. So this would have been like 1998. I decided I would work at a overnight camp in upstate New York for kids who had sort of like emotional and behavioral difficulties. And this is 1998. So think about the world of autism in 1998, right? Not a lot of services available. Certainly not a lot of overnight summer camps for kids with autism.
Right.
But I arrived at this camp not knowing about autism, really, not thinking about autism, not being motivated to work with kids with autism. But I just happened to have 3 kids with autism who I worked with closely over the course of the summer. And they were my favorite campers. They really sort of ran the autism spectrum in really interesting ways, So we had, I had one kid who was minimally speaking and I had another kid who was bilingual. I had one kid who was really easygoing and very social in his way, and another kid who was highly anxious and really needed things to be predictable and for him to sort of know what was coming next at all times. So I got back to college my senior year sort of thinking, I want to work with kids with autism, I found my thing. And at that point, again, this is 1999, 2000. My mom had been a special education teacher, and so I thought I'll be a special ed teacher. So I came up to Boston. I did a master's degree in special education at Boston College, and I taught in the Brookline public schools, and I taught 1 year in an inclusive preschool classroom. And then I taught a second year in a substantially separate classroom for kids with autism. And it was during that 2-year stretch where I was getting my master's degree and working as a preschool teacher that I sort of had this realization that I had both maybe made a misstep and had discovered something that I deeply loved. I mean, I deeply loved working with the autistic kids. And I was, as I continue to be really intrigued by the ways that they learned and the ways that they engaged and all the strengths that they had and all the difficulties that they had. But I sort of found myself with all these questions that I wanted to ask and no real way to answer them, So I decided I wanted to go back for my PhD, and it was at that point that I went back to do my doctorate work. And I know you and I have had conversations about that experience. So,
Yeah.
And that was something that I just loved, and I felt finally like I had found the thing that I was meant to do, and I still feel that way 24 years later, So I'm really lucky to still feel like I made the right choice.
That's beautiful. It's so cool that you have this camp counselor story, because literally the last person I talked to on the podcast, which is crazy because she was the first one. This is Dr. Jill Kreist. She works with aphasia.
Okay.
And her origin story was also as a camp counselor. And that was inspiring enough for her to want to go into this field. So yeah, it's cool. I'm seeing getting to hear a bunch of stories from people. I'm seeing some familiar threads pop up here and there.
Yeah, I think it's that immersive experience where you really are, in a sense, you take a role as a daily caregiver, and you really get that 24-hour-a-day sort of view on strengths and difficulties and needs and questions, and in a way that I think it's very hard to have a substitute for that. And of course, as a parent, I know that, sending your kid to sleepaway camp is nothing like actually being a caregiver for that child, but it gives you this teeny tiny little slice of insight into what life might be like,
Right. Yeah. I think so much of the time, when you take a course that is more theoretical, you get these you get these certain concepts, and then you're like, it must be this way. And then you go into the, when I've been working with kids, for example, it's like no one fits those boxes exactly. People that kind of float outside, and there's all this variability. And maybe that's something we could talk about. I was interested. You had this really cool paper, and this is not exactly the same topic, but it's on autistic linguotypes. And I think it's an example of kind of both differences and individual variability. A lot of that's wrapped up in there. But yeah, can you talk about what is an autistic linguotype? What is a linguotype?
Asked. We're still sort of figuring that out. So my colleague and friend, Emily Zane, and I came up with this term linguotype. Emily's a linguist. And when we came up with the term linguotype, we were using that term we were imagining it as sort of a parallel term to something like genotype or phenotype, right? So a way of characterizing a set of features about an individual. And in the case of the linguotype, we were picturing that to be language features. And the reason why we wanted to use the term linguotype is because we as a sort of community of individuals who care about and are interested in autism, we've known from the very beginning that autism does seem to be, and I guess I will say seem to be, characterized by sort of distinctive patterns of language use, right? So you remember, I hope when you took the autism class with me, we read Leo Kanner's original paper about autism, and in that original case series, he has these, just verbatim quotes from his clients. Patients is probably the word that he used, right? But with autism, and even then, he was noticing these distinctive ways of using language, and sometimes those distinctive ways of using language had to do with repetition, right? So echolalia or delayed echolalia. But it's not just that. There are ways that autistic speakers use language that are unconventional, the ways that they themselves generate spontaneous language and put words together into phrases and sentences is sometimes unconventional. So they might choose words that are unconventional word choices, or they might put words together in ways that are unconventional. And as a community, we've sometimes referred to those patterns as idiosyncratic language use, for instance, or pedantic speech. And those are terms that very much come from sort of a medical model, come from a deficit framework. And we felt as though we wanted a different way to be able to talk about them, because we weren't convinced that they are necessarily deficits. And so we wanted to choose a different term that was maybe less laden, more descriptive, and more sort of open to the possibility that at least some of these patterns of language use might not at all be deficit-based, but might reflect just a different way that language is organized or conceptualized in the mind of an autistic speaker, or might even potentially be volitional choices that the speaker is making in order to express something that is important to them as the speaker. So level of precision, for instance, right?
Leg wrists comes to mind.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe they think it's more humorous. Maybe they think it's more precise. Maybe they think it has a sensory connotation in a way that reflects their internal experience of the word. So that's the sort of story behind the term linguotype. I think really ultimately Emily and I just sort of feel like we have more questions than we have answers, but we're deeply fascinated by language use and autism, and we feel as though really digging into it in a thoughtful and sort of creative way might tell us some very cool stuff about how autistic individuals represent language.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and it's totally clear. I think the deficit model doesn't capture everything that's going on. I heard this really cool example recently. I was wondering what you thought about this. So there's this really tired philosophical example of talking about red, but we often think about red being this like objective label in the world, let's say. So the apple is red. And then most people have 3 cones, 3 options. They see red, but then some have 2. And then they see like a muddy greenish brown. We consider those people colorblind. I'm sort of colorblind. I have color deficits, but in some rare cases, some people actually have 4 cones. And in this case, they have a really much more detailed, vivid experience that is not red in the way that we would typically think of. And if it was the case that most people had 4, then the people that had 3 would be colorblind. So I was kind of thinking that this is sort of analogous to what you're talking about, and that in autism, there are these, experiences that can be super vivid across different domains. And that maybe the way that we cut up the world in the same way of talking about red doesn't capture what they're experiencing. And that's why we're seeing some of these differences. And they're probably like, different ways in which there's maybe color blindness and color vividness at the same time, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I was wondering what you thought about that example.
Yeah, I think that's a really good analogy. And I like it because I think that analogy can be used in a broad sense or in a specific sense. In the example that you're giving, it really is sort of tied to a sensory experience. And that's one of the things that we explored in the Linguatype paper, this idea that, it may be that individuals are coming up with their own words, right? Neologisms, which is sort of arguably really what that paper is about. Or choosing to use words in ways that might vary, right? Word choice that might vary from other people because they're trying to find a word that captures a sensory aspect of whatever their experience might be in the world. So I think the sensory components in the way that you sort of gave the example of red could certainly come into play. But I also think that there are ways in which sort of like the broader cognitive experience of meaning or intended meaning could also be reflected there, right? So Emily has this great example, and I'm going to get it wrong, but it has to do with sort of the way that you might describe. So, for instance, hanging a poster on the wall, right? Like if I were going to say that I'm putting a poster on the wall, I would say that I'm putting a poster on the wall, right? I'm going to hang that poster on the wall. But an autistic speaker might choose to say they're going to hang the poster near the wall because actually you're not putting it on the wall, right? You're putting it sort of like next to the wall. And so maybe that's the more precise word choice in their view, right? It's unconventional maybe to the sort of average speaker, but to their mind, it better captures their understanding of what it is that they're doing.
Yeah, totally. And it's not, it'd be incorrect to say that is a wrong, way of characterizing it. Because I think you mentioned, like there's some, in some languages, they do reflect some difference like that. Or, I was hearing some colleagues like thesis talk about differences. So there's these differences in Korean, for example, where they don't just have this on and in, like sort of general categories. They divide it up further into like tight fitting or loose fitting ons.
Yeah.
And so, they could be capturing something like that, right?
Totally. Yeah, I was just talking with a student about prepositions, actually. This student of mine is very interested in some of these threads around Linguatype. And we were talking about prepositions and how, prepositions are another thing that, the preposition that you use obviously varies across languages, but is also to a certain extent sort of like the rules are sort of arbitrary. Like, for instance, you'd say that you ride on the bus, but you ride in a car, right? Like, why? And those are just conventions. Those are just arbitrary to a certain extent. I mean, not entirely, but a lot of those feel like sort of arbitrary conventions that a language community has. But you may, as a speaker, may have to decide, are you going to prioritize what you think is actually the more accurate or precise term for the meaning that you're trying to convey, right? Or are you going to go along with whatever your language community dictates as convention, even if you think it's imprecise or wrong? You know what I mean?
Yeah, there's a tension, I think, for everyone, but especially for the,
Absolutely. So one of the things that I think we're sort of excited about doing is trying to gather some more information about the choices that autistic speakers make when in their everyday language use, and really talk to them about, why did you make that language choice, and what compelled you to pick that word versus another word? Did you think about a different word? Why ultimately did you choose the one that you chose? And then I think the other thing that we're really interested in is whether those language patterns, whether and how language use varies for autistic speakers according to their intended audiences. One of the things that we looked through a lot of first-person autistic accounts when we were writing that paper, and we read blogs and we listened to podcasts. And one of the things that sort of stuck with us is an autistic blogger, I believe, talked about how they tried to avoid using an autistic linguotype when they're masking. And I thought that was really interesting, right? What's the role of audience? What's the role of speaker awareness in who they're talking to? And the other thing that we're sort of curious about considering is whether there seems to be a difference when people are speaking versus writing. Does it matter if you're writing an email versus speaking to someone face to face? And why might the written modality look different than the spoken modality?
Oh, yeah. Oh, super interesting.
So yeah, tons of questions that we don't know the answers to, and we'll probably never be able to answer, but keeps us busy,
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to keep, exploring this question for not just for theoretical reasons, but for practical intervention reasons as well, to help us understand as like clinicians, when do we look for types of language that is actually, not something that we can correct necessarily or need to correct, but something that like reflects some important aspect of this individual's experience. All very cool.
I also think just in terms of, when there are communication breakdowns between two individuals, it can sometimes be useful to understand why there might be communication breakdowns. If people if a speaker and a listener don't seem to be converging on a common meaning, why might that be? Is it because the listener is expecting something from the speaker and the speaker is intending to give something different to the listener, right? So I think just with an eye towards making sure that autistic individuals and their communication partners have successful communicative interactions can be useful to understand what choices people are making and why,
Yeah. For sure. Yeah, communication breakdowns are only a problem if you can't work around them, I guess.
Exactly.
Or, yeah. Well, maybe we could talk also a little bit about the role of input in development and how, what's the best way to think about language input for autistic kids if they do have these sort of different sensory, perceptual experiences in development. What are some evidence-based ways that we can either, use that or maybe in some cases we don't need to use that because they learn it in a very similar way to typical kids. How can we think about all that?
Yeah, it's a really good question and one that feels like I almost don't know how to answer it. I think we've been chasing after that question and those answers for a long time because of the incredible heterogeneity in language outcomes that we see in autism, right? And I mean that both in terms of receptive language and expressive language. I think about language input, I think immediately, I guess, about building comprehension, building understanding, right? Building the model of language in the brain, in the mind. And then relatedly, of course, about spoken language. And those two things are deeply intertwined. I guess, we wrote my collaborator, Sudha Arunachal, and I wrote a paper about 10 years ago about lexical acquisition and autism. And in that paper, we basically concluded, we reviewed the literature and sort of basically concluded that lexical acquisition or word learning, right? Word learning, I guess, specifically, but more broadly, language learning, seem to progress mechanistically in the same way that it does in non-autistic children. and that there wasn't anything that suggested that the underlying processes were fundamentally different qualitatively. And that's an important conclusion, because if we felt like the fundamental mechanisms were different, that might suggest that a different kind of input was warranted. But we never really felt like there was any evidence to suggest that that was the case. And so, um, I think what we expect in broad strokes is that the same kind of sort of language nutrition that we would expect for non-autistic kids is the language nutrition that you need for autistic kids. Um, we've looked at some other more nuanced questions about word learning in kids with autism. But I think in broad strokes, from where I sit, I think that you want, high levels of good quality child-directed speech,
Yeah.
Doesn't all have to be one-on-one, doesn't all have to be child-directed. But that sort of immersive, language that we know to be good for all kids, is good for kids with autism. Now, I think we're left with this persistent question about why is it that some kids with autism struggle to learn language, and why is it that some kids with autism have difficulty using spoken language or expressive language in any modality. And I think that's really the sort of unanswered question. I think there are lots of different proposals about why that might be the case, but I don't think at the end of the day that we really have any good answer for that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of comforting to know that at least the basic advice of like, you should, get a lot of good nutrition, just like for eating or whatever, you want to eat, you want to get a good amount of language input, and it should be high quality. And like perhaps in joint attentional frames, although you have a study about autistic kids also learning from ambient language, like observing two adults talking to each other. But yeah, like it's comforting to know that like, okay, these things are important no matter what.
Yeah, absolutely. And we want to make sure that the language that they're receiving is a good language model, right? It needs to have good morphosyntax. It needs to have nouns and verbs. It needs to have subjects and predicates. It's like, it needs to be good language. And so I almost think sometimes thinking about it too hard might be counterproductive, right?
Yeah.
I think, just the natural adjustment that we use seems to be the right way forward. I think that there are some interesting questions about the like preferences of autistic kids for infant-directed speech or child-directed speech versus adult-directed speech. I think there's some conflicting findings on that. There's some interesting work on the extent to which kids with autism learn better from infant-directed speech or child-directed speech versus adult-directed speech. And I think there are some interesting future directions about trying to explore the role of individual variability in children's preferences, right? So do some autistic children have less of a bias towards IDS or CDS versus ADS? And if that's the case, do they then learn better in adult-directed speech versus child-directed speech? But I don't think the evidence is to a point where we would want to make formal recommendations about that.
Sure.
I think you want to speak in a way that your child finds interesting and motivating. And, you want it to be at a level that's sort of developmentally appropriate.
Yeah. It also kind of makes me think of in what ways, maybe it's just the like prosodic aspects, let's say, of infant-directed speech that maybe there's no preference in that domain, but like I would imagine that like the zone of proximal development sort of stuff that you want to keep like adult directed speech, if there, to the extent that there might be a preference for that, you probably want to keep it more simple in the beginning to develop those foundations,
Exactly. That's exactly right. And again, we want to make sure that we were talking about good nutrition, right? Like we want the input to be healthy input. It should have all the correct morphosyntax. It should have all the nouns and verbs that it needs, like we don't want to artificially simplify the language by like dropping,
right.
important morphological markers or something, right? Or not using verbs. Like we want to use good, healthy nutrition. We want to be a good language model,
Yeah. What do you think about, this is just something I've been thinking about from doing functional communication work and using carrier phrases and things like that, like, modeling, want more or something versus, something that's more appropriate in, I don't know, context.
I think that there's some interesting research out there. I don't know if you follow Courtney Venker's work, but she has a great paper out that looks at, the importance of using sort of robust, naturalistic language when we're talking to young autistic kids. And, sometimes when we're trying to provide us, sometimes I think it's easy to get in our own heads, right? That we want to provide a sort of a script, or we're trying to maybe oversimplify or make something formulaic. And I think the risk when we do that is that the nutrition of the language goes down a little bit, right? We have to make sure that we're including all the sort of natural rule-governed parts of language. If we want kids to learn those rules, then we got to follow those rules in the speech. So,
interesting.
I do think it's a balance of, meeting the child where they're at developmentally, right? Just in the same way that we do with all kids. I wouldn't talk to a 2-year-old the way I'm talking to you right now, right? We want the language to be accessible to them developmentally, but we also need it to robustly demonstrate the rules of the language,
Right. Yeah.
in a way that has enough variability in the input that the children can see the variability in the language. How are they going to learn it, right?
Right. And it probably, I'm sorry.
No.
Sorry, go ahead. No, it's just been making me think of like, so I was going over this old Steven Pinker example of like locative alternation. So you can, what is it? Load hay into the wagon and load the wagon with hay, but you cannot pour the water, pour the glass with water, right. But you can pour water into the glass. And that has something to do with like, the end state, like the verb contains information about the end state. So I just think that there are so many places in language that actually have really deep meaning that we don't consciously think about. And when we try to artificially, teach language in this simplified way, we actually, it's doing something like ultra processed food where you like, I don't know, you like make a bar where you're like trying to like, you're like, oh, we just need protein and fat and whatever. And so we're going to make this thing. And then what you realize that like, in real fruit or natural fruit, there's all these like cofactors and stuff like that are important for the whole piece. So yeah.
I love that analogy, Garrett. I'm going to steal that. We don't want to feed anybody cool. Ultra processed language, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's so good. I love that.
So you had this other cool study. I just love the way that you kind of push back against some of these, the ways in which we can be too, what's the word? I know too quick to kind of label everything as a deficit, right? So obviously there are certain ways in which, we want to help, and there are places where autistic kids struggle. But, some people have described like restricted interest, for example, as like something that might be like in autism as something that might be just, purely like we shouldn't have them focus on that. But you have this study that is showing that they can learn equally well from things that are their super focused interest and not. So I don't know. Could you just talk about that study
Yeah,
briefly?
totally. This was a super fun paper, and I appreciated the way that you opened this topic, Garrett, because I think kids, people with autism, the diagnostic criteria, one of the diagnostic criteria is the presence of these very sort of focused interests. And they go by different names, right? Repetitive interests or stereotyped interests or restricted interests in sort of the medical model. And then, sometimes people use language like passionate interests or personal interests or favorite interests when we're trying to sort of work outside of that medical model space. But I appreciated your opening to the topic because I think it's important to acknowledge that these interests, they're very common in autistic individuals, and they can introduce a lot of challenges. They can have detrimental effects on everyday life for the autistic individual. They can be the source of stress and anxiety. They can be the source of safety concerns. I think about kids who elope out of the house because they're trying to go find something or trying to go seek something out. They can be the source of stress and concern and fatigue for family members and caregivers. So I feel really excited about this project, but I also always like to acknowledge that I totally recognize that these interests are not a monolith, right? They have upsides and downsides. So I think the downsides have been well established. And so we were sort of interested in exploring some of the nuances around these interests. And, we are not the only people that are interested in that. There's a fair bit of research looking at the ways in which favorite interests or personal interests have upsides for quality of life, for joy, for enjoyment, for engagement, for motivation. We were curious to know whether the presence of these passionate interests or favorite interests would detract from learning or not. And, because we're language people, we focused on language learning. So we did a study where we presented two videos to kids. This was a Zoom-based study, so it was a remote study, but it was done synchronously in real time. And we showed the videos. We showed each kid a video teaching a new word. It was actually a new verb. And one of the videos was depicted using their favorite interest. So we had interviewed the families ahead of time. We partnered with the parents to do a Google search to identify an image that best represented their child's passionate interest. So we knew it was their most favorite thing.
Yeah.
And a lot of the kids were so excited and so hyped to see their favorite thing on the screen, which was really fun. So that was the sort of teaching a new word with their favorite interest. And then we had a control condition where we taught a different new verb using something that was of neutral interest. And we confirmed that it was of neutral interest with the parents. And we also confirmed that it was not something that they disliked. So it was, just something that they didn't have any particular sentiment about. What we found was, just as you very eloquently said, that they learned equally as well across both of those conditions. So that was interesting to us for two reasons. First of all, performance was very similar. So there wasn't an apparent advantage for using the favorite interest, but there also was no disadvantage for using the favorite interest. So in as much as favorite interests do, according to lots of other literature, seem to increase motivation and interest. And just anecdotally, we saw that, right? The kids got so excited to see their favorite thing on the screen. So if that's a way to increase buy-in, if that's a way to increase interest and attention and motivation, there's no evidence from our study that it interferes with, language learning activities. So that was a really fun study, and I think aligns really well with a lot of the other literature looking at these interests in kids with autism. What was interesting is that in our non-autistic kids, it did
Yeah.
interfere.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. That was super. Yeah. I wanted to ask you about that. What is your hypothesis? Why do you think that
Oh man, Garrett.
there was an effect there?
Well, can I ask you? Why do you think? We actually
Well,
don't have a good answer, so I'm curious.
yeah. One thing I was thinking about when I was reading that study was, I think you mentioned something about bottom-up salience versus top-down control.
Yeah.
And I wonder if, so broadly, when I think about both of those things, like bottom-up salience is something that it grabs your attention, and it's not something you have to try and do. And then top-down control is like more of a like this. It's a muscle almost that you develop and that develops over time, over development.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if there's just a difference in so for typical kids who are seeing their favorite interest, like this sort of, but the bottom up salience is like just so overwhelming that it's like kind of getting rid of their ability to use executive function in that instance to learn this word. But that there's something different going on in the other case, not to them. And yeah,
That's
not
sort of
super eloquent,
revealing
but that's what, yeah.
I mean, that I think that's kind of the best that we can do. If you read first person autistic accounts about passionate interest in particular, but also sort of attention more broadly, some autistic people will talk about a phenomenon of like an attention tunnel where it's like they're really like in the flow, in the zone. They're sort of like in a single-minded state around this interest or this topic or this whatever it is that's consuming them in the moment. It's almost like a vacuum. You're a black hole. It's sort of like sucking everything kind of into it. And that's a very qualitative description of this autistic experience that, and again, this is me just recounting things that I've read. So I'm sure an autistic individual would be much more descriptive in the way that they're able to present that. But we sort of wondered if it was something about that sort of way that interests and passions and are experienced by an autistic individual that's in this context advantageous, that it bootstraps learning in a way that it doesn't or didn't for the non-autistic kids. Or it could be a fluke, right? I mean, this is why we need replication studies. But who knows? It was interesting anyway, and not what we thought, what we were going to find.
Yeah. I guess that, there are different modes of attention, right? That maybe afford different types of learning. I don't know. So if you're in that flow state, like you can, I know this from playing music and playing guitar and stuff. You can kind of get into this like flow state and really process things differently versus like sometimes I'm really excited about something, but I'm just out all over the place and can't. Yeah.
The flow state
I don't know.
is. Yeah, I mean the flow state, that terminology is definitely, I think, goes hand in hand with some of the descriptions of the attention tunnel, where it's just like you're just like in a, you're just in it, you're immersed in it, and there's nothing that's going to break you out of it. And it's maybe that sort of smooth flow that's easier for kids with autism to get into, and maybe harder for the non-autistic kids. And again, we can't ever think about these things as being simplistically good or bad. I think these are things that probably serve you in some situations and don't serve you in others. But in this situation, it seemed to be a strength.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a really important thing to continue considering in the future, given that we have a lot more. I mean, something I've seen, something I'm doing my own research programs, sort of focused on how device use and digital environments impact communication development. And it seems like there is at least these digital devices afford this type of daily life where you can just, swipe on and keep repeating and watching the same thing over and over again, this restricted interest. And I've seen that a lot in practice where, you might have a kid who is just really into one little piece of a credit sequence or something. And they're just kind of doing that all day. I think it'll be important to know if those things are, because if it is following kind of a similar way of thinking with typically developing kids, where you do want to have this balance of bottom up and top down control, where you're actually practicing executive function skills, things like that. If you're never having the opportunity to do that, then I can see that being a real problem.
Yeah.
For attention. I don't know if you have any thoughts on the digital devices.
So it's so funny that you said that, Garrett, because what I spent my morning doing was reviewing the literature on learning from screens. Kids with autism this morning. We actually have a new. We're writing a new paper. We did a survey during the pandemic. We did a 5-year project, and we enrolled about 500 families. And that project was getting off the ground right at the start of COVID. And so we threw in this question into our sort of family questionnaire that asks parents, do you think your child learns from screens? Why or why not? And so now we're looking at this data from 500 families. Half of those families have a kid with autism and half of them have a child who doesn't have autism. And I have 2 thesis students right now who went through, coded all of the data. We're doing a mixed methods study right now with it's Sudha Arunachalam, my colleague at NYU, and Kelly Towson, Kelly Coburn, who's at Towson. And it's very interesting that, parents are very convinced that their kid these are preschool aged kids. And so parents in our study are certainly convinced that their child learns from screens. In lots of different ways, and they tell us all the things that they think their child is learning from screens. And I don't disbelieve them. I have a child, I can see what he's learned from screens. And if you look at the literature on parental perceptions of learning from screens, it is similarly pretty positive. Parents do report a lot of learning from screens. They also report a lot of concerns about screens, but they're really quite clear. They think that their child is learning a lot from screens. And then you look at the empirical, the more lab-based sort of direct assessment stuff. And it's just like, oh man, screens are not good. And so it was just really striking the divide between the parental perception stuff, where I do believe that kids are learning from screens. And I also believe that really more screen time, higher quantities is generally not good, But I think that there's this disconnect between those two narratives. And I don't know what the solution is. I mean, I know that, for instance, the AAP has tried to sort of offer some updated guidance about we know we can't say no screens. And so we say co-viewing is better and all of those things. But it feels like we really we're going to have to, as a community, have some, I think, kind of nuanced conversations about how do we do this, Yeah. Anyway,
right.
But it's, that's a whole nother podcast, Garrett.
Yes, that is. Yeah, I could go on about that. But we talked a lot about that with, different people, and so it is, like you said, a nuanced question. I feel like I tend to be more on the side of screens are net negative.
Yeah.
in development.
Yeah.
And like, I definitely don't deny that there would be learning happening.
Yeah.
And maybe in my head, at least, the reason why that learning pops out more is because it's often stuff that is one, like sort of restricted to some videos that are,
Yep.
maybe have weird or interesting language. And then
Yep.
two, it's stuff that the parent is not seeing. So that
Yeah.
would be more, it would be more salient to them to be like, oh, that's unfamiliar to me. So I can recognize that as something that I wasn't a part of. Whereas probably a lot of the other more foundational language stuff that they're getting from the parent, like it's not going to stick out as much.
Yeah.
Um,
Yep.
yeah. If your kid's suddenly talking about, I don't know, like a Fortnite, I don't know, person or something
Right.
like that, you're really like, where
Yeah.
did you learn that? Or
Yeah.
like some weird verb that they're using. So I don't know. That's my thoughts on it, at least. But I do feel like, yeah, you're right. Nuanced conversation is going to be really important. Like maybe starting to look at content level features, like what aspects of media are, what are the
And
mechanisms by
dosage,
which, yeah,
right?
dosage.
I mean, maybe you just
Yeah.
get a little dose and then you've learned and then let's put the screen away, I mean, video
Yeah.
modeling autism, right? We know video modeling is very effective.
Yes. There's some papers on that like Goldilocks zone too, where it's like possible that like maybe like this limited amount is positive, but beyond that, like coffee drinking.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, thank you. So I wish I had talked to you for so much longer. I know we're kind of nearing the end. I'll open it up just in case there's any questions. Feel free to type them in the chat. I did want to talk a little bit about, there's a few things that I want to talk about that we haven't had a chance to touch on yet. One is you have some cool work on the function of autistic questions. And I was wondering if we could talk about that.
Absolutely. So that was a really fun program of research that we got going maybe eight years ago because I was saying to you earlier, Garrett, I have a son who's 12 now. And when he was 2 or 3, he started doing the thing that all 2 and 3-year-olds do, which is just absolutely floor you with the number of questions that they ask. And my husband and I would just look at each other at the end of each day and being like, oh my God, how many, it was like, what, 200, 300? How many questions would this today? And I was really struck by just what a tool question asking was for my son. My son is not autistic, but I always say I learn more about child development from having a child than I did from so much of my other, sort of professional experiences. And so as I watched him grow up, I sort of immediately thought about like, how can I bring this back to my program of research on autism, right? And the beautiful thing about watching my son is that these questions are this very cool intersection of like language or at least communication, right? Of course, you can pose questions non-verbally, right? But language helps. So it's like language skills, it's like social skills, it's cognition and even like metacognition, right? Because like you kind of like the kid has to know what they know and what they don't know. And so it's this very cool intersection of all of these great developmental skills. And so I was really fascinated by the ways that he was curating his own learning. And so I immediately like went back to my lab people and was like, I think we need to look at question asking in kids with autism. And what we found, we've done a few studies now, and we seem to be finding the same pattern, which is that kids with autism ask questions. No big surprise there, right? And they ask questions that take different forms. They ask questions that serve different functions. They ask questions for different purposes. But they seem to ask questions about half as often as their non-autistic peers. And that seems to be especially true with unfamiliar individuals. So, given that questions are an incredible tool for kids to curate their own learning, both inside the classroom and out in the real world, it seems important for us as parents and providers to be paying attention to how kids are asking questions and to sort of provide those temptations or affordances for kids to ask those questions, because when a kid asks a question, it not only serves a purpose for them because they get the information that they need, but it helps you as the social partner to identify where their gaps in knowledge are.
Yeah.
So yeah, we have, we have so much other data sitting around the house, and we keep thinking, no, we got to do some more question asking stuff, but that's where we've gotten so far.
That's cool. Yeah, I like that idea of like verbal affordances, like you're saying. It was one thing I thought about, that you mentioned that the parents of autistic children, also they ask they have a richer, um, in many cases, like a richer model,
Yeah.
or they ask questions that might afford richer responses, which it might be an important thing in this sort of compensatory
Yeah.
strategy in a way. But yeah, I've given that advice to a lot of parents in the past, that like, because I've seen sort of different types of question asking behavior when I work with parents and kids, and a lot of times it's like these very rapid fire, like yes no questions, and the child is not, they're, because they don't have the opportunity to, in a way, they're not like giving descriptive answers, or rich feedback, or having these like reciprocal conversations. It's just like these like yes no responses, back to back. But if you ask something, even something different, like there's a big difference between, was your day good, versus like, tell me three things that happened about your today, or something like that. Like there's a, you get a different type of response. So
Yeah, absolutely. And even, sort of yes, no versus WH questions, right? I mean, just not
yeah,
only the kinds of answers that they demand, or demand is maybe a forceful word, that they allow for the child, right? Um, but the richness of WH questions, right? Like the grammatical richness of WH questions it's just, like, so thinking about back to our theme of language nutrition, right? Paying attention to the kinds of questions that you're using with your child, not just because they give your child different opportunities to use language in response, but because they provide a richer model, right, of the way that language can be used.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Oh man, so cool. I got so many other questions, but I feel like if I go down this other line of questioning, we're gonna go way past the hour. Um, yeah, what are you most excited about now? What do you think needs to be studied in this very exponentially quickly changing world?
What do I think needs to be studied? I mean, I think it's easy for me to go off in my own head and sort of get consumed by questions that I think are sort of theoretically interesting. But I guess if I bring myself down to earth and I think about the different stakeholders who I talk to, and who sort of remind me to pay attention to what's important, I think a continued research and clinical interest in supporting children who are minimally speaking, whether that's research to try to understand what is it that might lead to them being minimally speaking, and are there things that we can do to support language comprehension and expressive language in any modality, research into AAC, right? Clinical training in AAC. So, if I were really to think about, you know, what thread of research and clinical training would make enormous difference for, a significant community, significant proportion of the autistic community, I think that's probably it, right? And then there's so much that we just don't understand um, about about development in individuals who are minimally speaking, and the best ways to support them um, in schools, at home, after they leave schools and enter adulthood.
Yeah.
So it's actually not the work that I do, but I think if I were really to think about what is it that probably matters most in the real world, it'd be hard to ignore that, you know.
Yeah. Are there any takeaways from your particular work that have you maybe changed your mind about um, either autistic language or language more broadly? Um, one, and then two, maybe any takeaways that you'd like clinicians to at least think about or reconsider or ponder?
I think we've known for many decades, since really, Barry Prezant's work, in the 1980s and 90s, that, um, you know, spoken language and autism is communicative, whether that's echolalic language or whether that's language that's sort of being spontaneously put together in the moment by an autistic speaker. So, we've known for decades that that echolalia, delayed echolalia, scripting, whatever you want to call it, is communicative. And so certainly that, is a thread that's been woven through my own work in a variety of ways, and I think is a really important thing for everybody to remember. That's not a new idea, that's been around forever. But certainly an important one for clinicians to remember and to remind families of as well. So, I think really just appreciating that language is communication and that can be interpreted in lots of different ways, and to use that as the starting point and the sort of a place to start and to build on.
Beautiful. Yeah, I hope this doesn't go too far off the rails, but I wanted to know your thoughts on. So I also like my PI's. She's big in infant vocalizations, and her PI was Dr. Aller, who characterizing the stages of babbling. In any case, he has this. I've recently been working on this data set and looking at infant vocalizations, and a large amount of the protophones that kids make, like speech-like sounds that infants make, are done like in private and not directed at anyone. And we've been kind of talking about this as a form of like motor practice, which is intentional. Like, so we frame this all in as an active agent. The infant is an active agent, but like doing this sort of intentional practice, exploring the sonic space. So there's kind of these two prongs. They're both exploring the sonic space for like motor development stuff, and then also like they're foraging for social responses. So yeah, that's actually my PI's work. She looks at the physics of foraging and compares that to infants vocalizing in these day-long audio forms. But I was wondering your thoughts on, just to make sure I'm getting this right. Do you think that all language utterances are like serve, like they have an intentional social like communicative purpose, or could there be an aspect of practice that's also part of that?
Yeah, I think all of the above, right? I mean, I think we probably all use self-talk, self-directed speech. And for some individuals, whether autistic or not, that might be actually spoken out loud, or that might be sort of internalized. So I suspect that everything you've just said also applies to autistic individuals and also applies to different levels of language use. I mean, it's an interesting question, and your point about the role of motor and oral motor, just back to an earlier point, there are a lot of terrific scientists out there who are looking at the role of oral motor control in minimally speaking individuals, and trying to consider whether there's a role for oral motor function there. So I think you're right to wonder about the role both of sort of self-directed language, socially directed language, or utterances or vocalizations, whatever you want to call them, right? But also the role of oral motor. I think the wonderfully complex thing about human development is that we can't pull any of these things apart, right? Learning is embodied. It just is. And so we can't pretend it's not,
Yeah.
So I have zero answers for you, Garrett, but I think they're great questions to ask. And, I think I think more and more the language development community and autism is very much intersecting with the motor development community and autism, because it seems inevitable, right, that these two
Yeah.
things have to be connected.
Yeah. Yeah. Like you're saying, is like necessarily embodied. I think
Yeah.
you talked about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
it involves this physical pushing out of air and all this
Exactly.
muscle coordination. Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Rhiannon. You're an inspiration, and thank you so much for your time. If people want to get involved, where can they find you? Can they reach
Yeah,
out with questions or
you can
anything?
reach out. Yeah, you can find me on Emerson's website. Absolutely. Just Google me, and I'm my profile's there. Please feel free to reach out with questions or suggestions. We always love to hear from parents and families. We love to hear from autistic individuals. We I didn't get a chance to mention this, but my lab works with an autistic advisory board. So we talk to autistic parents, we talk to autistic adolescents, we talk to autistic speech language pathologists, to autistic scientists. And we're always curious to hear from folks who might find our work interesting or might have suggestions about how to make it better.
Awesome. Thanks again. And everyone, take care, stay curious, and hope to see you in the next episode.
Thanks so
All
much.
right. Bye.